Hey everybody, I hope y'all having a fantastic week this week. As we come into our lesson today, we're going to be looking today at the story of Jacob and Esau. Now, Jacob and Esau were twins who were the children of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, of course, was the son of Abraham, who we talked about last week, and how Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, his only son Isaac, who was his only heir to the promise of God from that. So as we go on, as we look today, we're going to look at Isaac's two sons that he had, Jacob and Esau, and we're going to see what happens here in this story between the two of them. But first of all, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been asked to do something where you didn't know exactly what you were doing? Maybe you were asked to take on a role in a band, or to lead something, or to do something that you didn't know everything about, or you didn't know how to do, you never known how to do before. There have been many times whenever I've been given those kind of situations before, where it's like we don't know what we're doing, we try to figure it out, and sometimes you just have to work through things and figure things out as you go through your life. So as we go through and we kind of look at that, this is what we're going to look at today, and we're going to see that today is that sometimes we're going to say that it's sometimes you have to know the whole story in order to be able to do something effectively. And that's what happens here. So, sometimes whenever you don't know how to do things, or, you've been asked by a parent to do something, or a teacher gave you an assignment and something just didn't make sense, it's hard to comprehend that. It's difficult. What would have made it easier was to either have something to look at, have an example to look at, things like that. Me, myself, I'm a visual learner whenever it comes to anything. So whenever I ask someone to do something, like, oh, do this, I'm like, that doesn't do me any good, right? You can tell me that over and over and over again, and I may not get it, I may not understand it. But if I see someone do it, and then I can repeat it, then I'll be able to do it, right? I'll be able to do it correctly. And so that's what we see here, and that's what we're going to kind of look at today and go from there. So, and it's just like a puzzle. If I gave you a puzzle that was a couple hundred pieces, and I asked you to put it together, but you didn't see what was on the box to see what the puzzle was supposed to look like, it becomes harder because you don't know what has, and it's harder to work for. You don't know what colors to look for and what sections and things like that. And so it becomes harder to do that. It would have been easier if you would have seen the top so you knew what it was going to look like. Life's like that, right? We don't know how all the pieces for us fit together for God's big picture and his plan for humanity, but we do know that they do fit, and we just have to sometimes take by faith that they're going to fit, they're going to work together, and it's all going to come together in the end, and that God sees, no matter what it is, God sees it as beautiful. So we just experienced, seeing the big picture in action, how that we have the benefit of having the whole Bible, of seeing the whole big picture of the Bible. We have all the stories in the Bible, all the people that are in the Bible. We know about them. We know what happens, and we know that. But you got to remember, at this point, for Jacob and Esau, and for Isaac and for Abraham, they didn't know what was going to happen. They were only having to depend on God. That they knew what was going to happen in the future at some point. And so we're going to see an example here where Jacob and Esau, that one of them, Jacob's family, Jacob and his mom, play God. They try to do things their own way, just like what Abraham did, right? Remember, we talked last week how that Abraham, or a couple weeks ago, how Abraham promised that Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a child together. And whenever that didn't happen, whenever it wasn't happening for them, they're like, oh, they're old, it's not going to happen. Abraham's handmaid and Abraham had a child. And that caused other problems because they tried to play God. And it creates some problems as well whenever you try to do something that you're not supposed to do. And that's what happens in the situation. They didn't have the whole big picture, so they had to deal with piece by piece as they were giving them. And sometimes they try to put the pieces in the wrong place. And that's how they end up getting in some issues and some problems. And so kind of connecting the dots from where we were last week. Jacob and Esau, as I mentioned, are the grandsons of Abraham. They're the sons of Isaac. Isaac was the only heir of Abraham, and we talked about that earlier. God has promised Abraham that his descendants would be innumerable. Remember, he said that they would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea, and that the whole earth would be blessed through them. Sarah and Abraham got impatient waiting on God, and they tried to do things accomplished through Sarah's handmaid, but that didn't work out. But God kept his promise, and Isaac was born. Isaac was born. And that's what we're going to get through today. So we're going to be reading pretty much most of the story of Jacob and Esau. It's going to be a lot of scripture, so kind of strap in. We'll kind of go through it as quickly as possible. If I get to the point where I need to summarize, I'll summarize in there for you. There's one longer section we're going to read later. So we'll see what happens as we go along. So what we're going to do is we're going to be reading in Genesis chapter 25 to begin with, and we're beginning reading verses 19 to 21. So Genesis 25, verses 19 to 21. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So here we kind of see the start of this. We see the start of this story. Isaac, once again, was born miraculously, right? Because remember, Sarah was barren, and Sarah was further on advanced in years, right? She was probably about 90 when she gave birth. And 90 then wasn't as 90 today, because they still lived a little bit longer at this time. They lived sometimes over 100 years, but that was still old to give birth to a child. And so we see that, but that's amazing if you think about it. But also, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, was barren as well. And so we see that Isaac was asking for children as well. Once again, knowing what God's promise was to Abraham, that all the descendants, all the world would be blessed through him. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea. And yet, his wife couldn't have a child. So he prayed, and then miraculously they had a child. They had children. And so, we don't know how, Isaac's faith of knowing that Abraham and Sarah, the story of his birth, affected his faith, but he had faith, and so God blessed that and allowed Rebekah to have children of her own at this point. And God answered his prayers. And now we're going to read verse 22 to 28 of that section. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from you shall be divided. The one will be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." When her days to give birth were complete, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. And afterwards his brother came out, with his hands holding Esau's heel, so that his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So here we see the story of the birth of Jacob and Esau. Right, we see this, and we start to see some problems forming, and there's some things that are going to happen. And as we go through and we read this, remember what we talked about, and we just read when it talked about how that the older would serve the younger. Remember, back in these days, back in the Bible times, back in this time period, the oldest one was the kind of one that carried on the family name, that was responsible, and we kind of have some of that today in our society, not to the same extent, but we have some of that in our society today. That the oldest son, the oldest person, is, the one who gets the better inheritance, who is in charge of the family, things like that. And so that's what we see, and we see that today. It helps us understand that, think about this, is that these people, these children came out, and they were fighting in the womb. Fighting in the womb. And one of the things I want to point out is, and we'll see why this is later, but, we see here, it's funny, we as kids maybe know that our parents maybe have a favorite child. I don't know if that's the situation between you and your family, but I know that in my family, there's one son who seems to be favored and does better with, both parents, or with the same situation, and it's kind of like they're the favorites. Whether it's like the personalities are the same or they like the same things like that can cause you to have that. But we also see the dangers and the pitfalls of favorites, as we see time and time again in the Bible. And we see here that the Bible specifically mentioned that, Isaac loved Esau because he ate the game. Esau was an outdoorsman. Isaac was probably an outdoorsman, someone who liked to go hunt, fish, all those kind of things. Whereas Isaac was more favored with his mom. He liked to stay in tents, help her cook, do all these things. And so we see that the favorites form based upon the personality, and it's not, and in other words, the point is we should never have favorites. But we know that, God's promise to Abraham would be fulfilled through Jacob and not Esau anyways, because of what he told Rebekah in this passage, is that the older would serve the younger, that they would be at war. They were fighting in the womb, and they were going to be fighting long after this. And so we're going to see some deception later on, and some favorites, as Rebekah wanting her favorite son to be blessed by Abraham. And we're going to look at that here in this next passage that we look at, which is going to be Genesis 27. Now, kind of in between these two passages, we see a couple things. We see that, and then at the end of verse 20, in the end of chapter 25, Jacob and Esau, are doing this, and Esau's out. He's hunting. He comes back and he's starving. He hasn't had any food for a while. He hasn't had a successful hunting trip, or whatever he is. And he came back and he was hungry and starving. And Jacob was there making a soup. And so, in other words, Esau sells his birthright, and then the fact that he was the oldest one, his part of the inheritance, so that he can have some soup, so that he can fill his belly. So Esau gave away his birthright, which was his claim to the larger inheritance that he would have received to Jacob in the beginning. And so that's what happens in between. And then, so that's already on there, where we see that Jacob kind of is a deceiver, right? He starts to deceive people, trick people. We don't know if he tricked people, if he tricked Esau out of his birthright, or if it was, we just have a brief story about him and that it was sold to him. And so we see that, and so just remember that. Remember that Jacob is deceitful and tricks people, and it comes back to bite him in the butt later on, and we won't look at that, but I'll mention that a little bit later on as we go through and we see this. So we're going to see in Genesis chapter 27, we're going to read verses 1 to 27 to start off with, and like I said, this is going to be the longer section that we're going to read, but we're going to get the whole gist of the story. So let's look at that real quick. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his older son to him, "My son." And he answered him, "Here I am." And he said, "Behold, I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out into the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may be blessed before I die." Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father speaking to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will fill me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing." His mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice, and go, bring it to me." So he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared delicious food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And the skins of the young goat she put on his hands, and on the smooth parts of his neck. And she put the delicious food and the bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob. So he went to his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you have told me. Now sit up and eat my game, that your soul may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near me that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother's Esau's hands. So he blessed them. He said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it near to me, that I may eat my son's game and bless you." So he brought it near to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed." So here we see that Jacob, at the prompting of his mother Rebekah, is told to go and to find food and to bring it to Rebekah so that she can prepare food so that Jacob can get the blessing instead of Esau. And so it starts out, we see this, and Jacob's life starts out being deceitful. He starts out with this. It starts out him going and trying to do things, trying to do this. And we notice that Jacob's response to Rebekah's plot is very much like, he's like, but mom, Jacob is trying to do the right thing. If you think about it, he's trying to say, look, this isn't going to work. We're stealing what Esau has been given is sinful. But as mothers can do sometimes, she was able to manipulate her son to be able to get the blessing because she wanted that for her favorite. Because remember, Jacob was Rebekah's favorite son. Esau was Isaac's favorite son. And so we see here, and instead, he didn't say that they wanted to deceive him. He was like, but he should have. He should have said, "Mom, this is wrong. We're not trying to deceive him." But he went along with it. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He just was kind of questioning, well, this isn't going to work because I'm not hairy. He was smooth. And we see that in society today, right? We see that people are different. People have different hair. Like, if you look at me, I have hair on my arms and on my hands, and some people, and adult males, don't have any. It's just we're all different, right? And so, but that was one of the ways that Isaac was going to be able to tell the difference between Jacob and Esau. And he went through, and Rebekah and Jacob went through the plan, even though they knew that it was sinful, even though they knew that it was wrong. They went through it over and over and over again. And so that's what we see. Now, as we look at it, it would be hard for us to rebuke a plan that's sinful sometimes, depending on who it comes from. I mean, if your parents tell you to do something, a lot of times you're going to trust them, even if it's the wrong thing to do. You may trust them because they're your parents, or you may want to please them because they're your parents. And so we have these situations where it's harder for us to say something is wrong and say something is sinful because our friends are doing it. And that's where peer pressure comes in, and that's something that you all deal with frequently. You all deal with peer pressure where your friends are like, "Oh, it's okay, go ahead, do it." And then you get in trouble because of it. Right? Or even though it's wrong, you do it anyways because your friends are doing it. That's why it's important for us to stand up to know what we believe so that we don't give in and give in to peer pressure. Because God wants to we need to make sure we do what's right, even though our parents. I mean, if your parents tell you to go and do something that's is wrong, if it goes against the Bible, you shouldn't do it. And your parents probably are not going to ever ask you to do something that goes against what the Bible says. But you may have friends who do that, close friends, good friends who do that. So make sure you follow what the Bible says over what anyone else says. And we see the lies and the deception, the level of the lies that they have to go through. I mean, we come in and they put Esau's clothes on there, because, and you got to remember, Esau and Jacob both, everyone pretty much has a smell, and we all know this, right? Whether it's a cologne or whatever. But back then they would have had cologne, they would have just had their natural smell would have been different. Esau's garments would have smelled probably, of sweat and work and all that stuff, being out in the field, as it said in the passage, right? That's what Isaac said that it smelled like. Whereas, Jacob's would have maybe smelled more like food or something, because he was in the tents and he liked to be around with his mother more, so it wouldn't have smelled as I guess you could say manly as you may think traditionally manly things smell. But we see this time and time again, the lies. They do that. I mean, they go in, they do the food, they do the clothes, they put goat's hair on the back of his neck and on his arms so that he feels hairier than what he does, like he has more hair, so he feels more like Esau than Jacob. And so we see that this keeps on happening over and over again. All this was to steal the blessing from his father. The whole purpose of this was so Isaac would give the blessing to Jacob and not to Esau. What we see time and time again is that sin a lot of times leads to more sin. And that's what was happening here with Isaac and with Jacob and Rebekah, is that they started with one thing and they had to do something else and something else, something else. All these sins started adding up over and over and over and over again. And it's just, it seems the blessing with Isaac came, with so much stuff, that blessing that Isaac was giving to Jacob was supposed to give to Esau. It came with wealth, with power, with authority. It was important to fact out that Isaac's spoken words were like an unbreakable contract. That was a covenant. Once he gave that blessing to his son, there was no taking it back. There was no going back. There was no transferring it to anyone else. It was Jacob's and Jacob's alone. We couldn't just simply unbless Isaac and just say, oh, well, you know what? Because he had been deceived. Once that blessing was spoken, it was done. It was final. It was like a contract. So now let's go and let's look at verses 28 to 29 and see what the blessing that Isaac was giving entailed for them. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So here, Isaac is blessing Jacob. He's pretty much giving him everything, full control over everything. Let's think about this. The things that were given to him, that Isaac was blessing Jacob with, were abundance, prosperity, power, and security. Jacob basically became the ruler of the family. And that's the way families worked back in this time. Is Isaac was basically the ruler over the family. He decided everything for the family. He decided everything. And whenever the elder male would pass on, the father would pass on, someone else would take his place. Typically it was the oldest, and that's why, Isaac was prepared to bless Esau with that, because Esau was the oldest. And so we see that. So he would have discretion over the family's wealth and authority over the whole family, the power, and all of this stuff. The land, the livestock, all this stuff would become his. And so we see that that's what was happening. That was what was given him. That's why it was a big, huge thing for this to happen. Now let's finish reading up the rest of this chapter real quick and see what happens with this. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out of the presence of Isaac his father, Esau his brother came in from hunting. He also prepared delicious food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am your son, your firstborn Esau." Then Isaac trembled very violently and said, "Who was it that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it before you came, and I have blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed." As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceeding great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me even also, my father. But he said, Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. Esau said, Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he had cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. Then he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me? Isaac answered to Esau, Behold, I have made him lord over you and all his brothers. I have given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. And then what can I do for you, my son? Esau said to his father, Have you but one blessing for me, father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then Isaac his father answered to him, Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. But your sword shall live, by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing of which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, The days of mourning my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother Jacob. But the words of Esau, her oldest son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob to Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, Behold, your brother Esau confronts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise and flee to Laban my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. What should I brief of you both in one day? So here we kind of see the end of the story and kind of see what happens at this point. So Esau is furious that Jacob has come and stolen his birthright, has stolen his blessing, has stolen the blessing that Isaac was going to give to him. He's furious with this. You know, God didn't forsake his promise to Rebekah, even though they lied and cheated and deceived their way to this status. So we don't know what would have happened had they not done this, right? We know they did it, and God still blessed them and put, Jacob over Esau. But we also see what happened before. We go back to Abraham and Sarah and how they tried to take things and do things in their own hands, in their own power, by them trying to have a son with Sarah's handmaid Hagar. And we see what happened there. But yet God didn't use that. But yet God was still going to use this and allow Jacob to have the promise that he gave to Rebekah to fulfill them. Just as Isaac's words, God's promise is absolute. He doesn't revoke his promise because we can't keep ourselves from sinning. And that's phenomenal for us, right? That's phenomenal for us that God has a plan for us. His plan for us is that, and no matter what we do, we're not going to break that covenant. But just as Jacob and Rebekah had corrupted the joy that came from God's plan for them, Esau's hatred and anger was never part of God's promise. The contempt and fear of Jacob they would have to live with his whole life were direct consequences of that sinful action. So God may still love us. God still loves us no matter what we do. And his plan is still going to be fulfilled, and he can still use us in our plans and trust in his word. But yet sometimes God uses that, but there's still consequences for those sins. There's still consequences for the things that we do and the sins that we do. And that's what's happened here. So there's consequences because of the deception. The consequence is that these two nations between Jacob and Esau would be fighting forever. That would be just a struggle. And Esau's hatred lived on time and time again. And so we see that, and we see that Jacob was deceived, and later on, I don't believe we're going to talk about this next week, but we're going to see that Jacob we know that Jacob ended up getting deceived because he went to Laban and he wanted to marry Rachel, but then he had to work 7 years for Laban, And then he ended up getting Leah. And so that's not who he wanted. So then he ended up having another daughter, working another 7 years so that he could have Rachel as his wife. So he ended up having 2 wives. And that creates problems because we're going to look at the story of Joseph and once again, see the problems that sometimes favoritism can cause, with this. And we see that maybe if Isaac and Rebekah wouldn't have shown favoritism towards his son, maybe things would have worked out differently. I don't know. But we see that favoritism a lot of times causes problems. And that's what happens here. But as we study the Bible, remember that we see these echoes of the gospel throughout these things. And we see the echoes of the gospel in this story. Right? God can work and do things in ways that we don't understand. And for good, things that we do that may be bad or situations we go through may be bad, he can work those for good in our lives. Just like he worked out the fact that And later on down the road, Jacob and Esau do come together. He sends his family. He comes back, and instead of Esau killing him, he welcomes him with open arms. And so we see that there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to Romans 8, and we're going to read that passage here. So we're going to read Romans 8. And so this is Romans letter to Paul to Rome. And the readers are actually suffering much at the hands of the Roman Empire. And so we're going to see that there. And they're going to be suffering a lot. And in fact, for the fact that they are Christians. And Paul's trying to encourage them and help them to see that just because they're going through suffering is that God's can use that in their lives and make that suffering beneficial to them. All right, so we're looking at Romans chapter 8, and we're going to be beginning in verse 26 to verse 28. Verse 28 is probably one that you've heard before. We're going to look at it again and see here. So Romans 8, verses 26 to 28. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So you've probably heard this passage before, and think about this. And as we think about it, let's think about these verses. Even when things aren't going well, sometimes you get to the point, and maybe you haven't got to this point yet in your lives, but there comes to a point sometimes in your life where you get to the point where sometimes you just don't know what to pray. You don't know what to pray. You don't know what to ask for. But, the truth is that, God knows. In my life, sometimes it's just like, I didn't know what to pray for at times in my life. I mean, there was one time in my life whenever it was like I had so much going on. I was losing my job. I was going through some anxiety and some depression, and I didn't know what to pray for. And so and maybe that's the way it is with you. Maybe you deal with, sometimes it's like you're dealing with the death of a close loved one, a family member, friend. You're dealing with something else. Big in your life, bad grades, whatever it is, God is there for us. Sometimes you felt confused. You just don't know what's going on. And you don't know how to pray. And that's okay. Truth is that God knows and sees everything. He's omnipotent. He knows everything. That's what omnipotent means, is he knows everything. We see these things, and God knows what's going on in our hearts. So even when we don't know what to pray, we still pray, but just pray to God, and God knows what we need. God knows what we need before we even ask it, but yet he still wants us to ask. He still wants us to know, to reach out to him, to bring that to him for us. He knows what's going on, whether it's junk happening around you or it's a life-building experience. God knows what's going on in your life. As we reread verse 28, it says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. All things work together for good. In all things, good work and according to his purposes are some of the key phrases from that verse. you know. But it doesn't necessarily mean that God's going to make everything happy for us. You know, just because we're Christian doesn't mean we don't suffer, doesn't mean we don't go through things of this life. Doesn't mean that we don't deal with issues or have issues that come up. It doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with death. We don't have to deal with sin. We don't have to deal with the things of this world. No, that's not what happens when we're Christians. Yes, it might be nice if it would happen. It might be nice not to deal with sin, not to have to deal with all these things, but yet that's not God's plan. You know, God's plan for us. You know, for those who are called according to his purpose is one of the key phrases in there. And we need to understand that part of it. You know, good works in our lives. You know, God desires for us to be happy and desires our happiness. But, you know, a lot of times God has a much higher perspective in mind, a different perspective in mind. You know, God's ways aren't our ways. You know, we don't always see eye to eye what our plans are. God may have different plans for us to go through. I don't think anyone has any plans to go through and enjoys or wants to have to deal with the death of a loved one, wants to have to deal with a serious disease, wants to have to deal with any of that stuff. But yet God can do that. You know, God can work those things in our life. The experiences that make us unhappy today can be used for a much richer happiness tomorrow. And, you know, we may not know why God works things out the way he does now. We may never find out while we're here on this earth. It may be whenever we're in heaven before we find out, or we may not even care once we get to heaven what happens. You know, this should change the way that we experience God through our hard times, is that he's there for us. Even though we sin, he still is working out things for our good. You know, I want to challenge you to really soak in this impact your life. Is that, you know, God has a plan for us. You know, he wants plans for us to be successful, to be happy. But sometimes we have to go through sufferings in this life. Sometimes we have to go through things. And, you know, sometimes for what our plan is, we try to squeeze into God's plan, and it may not be God's plan for us. And so you just have to be, you know, willing to do that and trust in God that he knows what's going on, and allow him to make his plan a reality in us. So, you know, let's just talk about this a second, you know, before we wrap up. You know, we've learned some today about God's promises. You know, God made a promise to Rebekah that the younger child would serve, the older child would serve the younger child there. We saw how Rebekah overheard Isaac planning to bless Esau, and then convinced Jacob to go and deceive his father because of that. You know, and took matters into her own hands. You know, Jacob didn't trust God either. He didn't just say, look, I know what this promise is, but yet he joined the plot. He joined this deceptive plot without even thinking twice about it, without even, you know, questioning his mom. He just went ahead with it and just like it was what he was supposed to do. The temptation that Rebekah and Jacob faced is very common. A lot of times we want to force in our plans, our will, what we want into something to get a blessing, whenever God has a different way for us to get a blessing. You know, we don't trust God and provide it in his time, you know, by his power and in his way. Sometimes the good stuff isn't really good, and people want it anyways. You know, some things you think about, like drugs, alcohol, junk food, you know, inappropriate TV and video games. All those things may seem good, but they're not good, right? They may seem good for you. They may give you a high or a pump of adrenaline or something like that, or it may comfort you in some way, but yet they're not good for you if you think about it. You know, however, you know, the good stuff is truly, most of the time, good stuff's good, right? You know, good stuff's good. You know, think about, you know, but a lot of times we try to get this good stuff on our own by acting outside of God's will. Whenever we do that, we corrupt it, we change it. You know, having good grades is phenomenal, is awesome. But if you cheat to have good grades, that's not good. And that's not part of God's plan for that. Lying to keep the peace, lying just so you don't have to fight, sex outside of marriage, all those things all those things are outside of God's will for us, but they may appear good. right? They may appear good. Have you ever hatched a plot to kind of have something be good? But it required them to do something outside of God's will. I'm not going to get you to respond or anything like that, but just think about that internally for a second here. We try to do these things, and if we got to do something that seems good or seems God's will, but it goes against what the Bible says or goes against the character of God, then we have to kind of think about it and try to understand that maybe that's not what we should be doing. Maybe that's not what we should be doing. There's three big components of letting God be God that we're going to look at and close with here. We're going to look at His power, His way, and His time. Those are three things that we have to look at. These are three big ways that we don't trust God. We don't trust God's schedule. We want what we want when we want it. We'll say that, we want to be married. Maybe you want to be married, and you want to be married, but you go with the first person who's willing to marry you. But maybe that's not God's person for you, and you're not listening for God's will, but you want it on your time. You want it now. You don't want to wait. God's power. We think that we can overcome and do things on our own to get God's will, but yet God in His power can do things greater than we could ever do. We act as if we don't need God. We act in our own power, like we don't need God to get through the situation. And God's way. We think that the way that we do things justifies them. We think, it's okay if I cheat because I'm going to get good grades and get into a good school. Well, you know what? The end doesn't justify the means. Yes, it's important if you want to go to school to get into a good school. But if you cheat to get there, that's not part of God's will. That's not part of God's way. God's way will never be for you to do that. So let's go back to the story of Isaac and Jacob and Esau, for a second here. Let's just think about this. That even though his wife Rebekah was barren, Isaac prayed and didn't seek his own will. Didn't seek to do things his own way, and God blessed them. Right? And in God's timing, they had two children, Jacob and Esau. God's keep His promises, and Isaac was confident that God was going to keep His promises in there. The verse in Romans tells us that we don't see the big picture enough, even though we don't know what, even though we may know what to pray, we don't pray. So the Holy Spirit prays for us according to God's will. Sometimes when we don't know what to pray for, the Holy Spirit prays for us, intercedes for us on our behalf. And together, these verses show us that God may not answer prayer in the way we think. He should. And sometimes it's hard for us to accept that, but we should accept that. Can you accept that God knows what's best for you? And God knows what's best. Whether or not God answers our prayers the way we think He should or not, we know that God keeps His promise to us. And we need to watch out for our sinful nature. And regardless of that sinful nature, God still keeps His promise to us. God still keeps His promise to us. And we know that God has promised that He's going to work out all the details. He has all the details already worked out in an awesome way to benefit us and glorify Himself. And even though things may not work out how you want them to now, God has a bigger plan in mind. And so let's keep that in mind as we go throughout this week. Thanks again so much for watching as we go through this. So if you have any questions or anything, look, my email is down in the description below. And also the names of our social media for Instagram and Snapchat are down there as well. So follow us so you can follow along with the daily devotions that we have. Thanks, and I hope you have a fantastic week.